The rain was relentless that evening, drumming against the windows of the small veterinary clinic on the edge of town. Inside, the air was thick with a mix of antiseptic and quiet resignation. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows over the waiting room, where an older woman sat clutching a cardboard box to her chest. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of the decision she had to make. Inside the box, barely larger than her hands, was the blind kitten. He was impossibly small, his fur a patchy mix of black and gray, damp from the rain that had seeped through the cardboard. His tiny body shivered uncontrollably, though it wasn't just from the cold, it was fear, confusion, and exhaustion. His milky, sightless eyes were half closed, giving him an expression of quiet surrender, as if he knew he was fighting a losing battle. This wasn't the first time the kitten had been abandoned. Found near a trash bin in an alley, his frail body told a silent story of neglect. His ribs were visible under his thin coat, and a small wound on his hind leg had begun to fester, the skin around it inflamed and raw. Whoever had left him there hadn't cared enough to even give him a chance. And now, here he was, at the clinic, not for a second chance at life, but for what many would call the kindest option. The vet, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Harper, glanced at the kitten with a heavy heart. She'd seen cases like this too often, animals brought in after the world had already turned its back on them. Her assistant, Sarah, stood nearby, her expression unreadable but her hands fidgeting with the hem of her scrubs. Neither of them wanted to say what they were both thinking: this kitten didn't have a future. The room itself seemed to mirror the hopelessness of the situation. The walls were painted a pale green, meant to be soothing, but instead, they seemed to absorb the gloom. The soft hum of the ventilation system was the only sound, broken occasionally by the distant bark of a dog in one of the back rooms. The woman who had brought the kitten in finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found him like this. I thought maybe someone could help, but," her words trailed off, her guilt and sorrow hanging in the air. Dr. Harper nodded, her professional mask firmly in place, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of sadness. "We'll take a look," she said, though she already knew what the outcome would be. The kitten's injuries, his blindness, his malnourishment, they all pointed to one conclusion. As Dr. Harper carefully lifted the kitten from the box, he let out a faint, pitiful mew. It wasn't the sound of protest, but of defeat, as if he had already given up on the idea that anyone could help him. Sarah turned away slightly, unable to meet his sightless gaze. The room seemed to grow colder as Dr. Harper placed the kitten on the examination table. The cold metal surface made him flinch, but he didn't have the strength to struggle. Instead, he lay still, his tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. For a moment, everything was still. The rain outside, the soft hum of the clinic, the distant bark, they all faded into silence. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic beat of the kitten's fragile heart, a sound so delicate it was almost drowned out by the weight of the moment. And then, just as Dr. Harper reached for her stethoscope, the door to the room swung open. The sound startled everyone, breaking the heavy silence. None of them could have imagined that the life of this blind, broken kitten was about to take an extraordinary turn. The examination room felt colder than usual, as if the chill from outside had seeped through the walls. The fluorescent light above flickered briefly, casting fleeting shadows over the cold steel table where the kitten now lay. His tiny body, no larger than a curled-up glove, seemed so fragile against the harsh, unyielding surface. His fur, damp and matted, offered little protection against the chill that seemed to emanate from the metal beneath him. Dr. Harper stood by the table, her gloved hands hovering for a moment before she reached out to adjust the kitten's position. His body was limp, offering no resistance, and his head lolled slightly to one side. His breaths were shallow and uneven, each one a faint whisper of effort. She couldn't help but notice how light he was, as though life itself had barely anchored him to this world. Sarah, the veterinary assistant, stood a few steps away, clutching a clipboard against her chest like a shield. She was watching Dr. Harper closely, her lips pressed into a thin line. In the few years she had worked at the clinic, she'd seen animals come and go, some saved, others lost. But this moment felt different. The kitten's blindness, his malnourishment, the infected wound on his hind leg, it all screamed of a life stacked against him. Dr. Harper leaned in closer, her stethoscope pressed gently against the kitten's tiny chest. She closed her eyes, focusing on the faint rhythm of his heart. It was there, weak and unsteady, but it was there. For a brief second, she allowed herself to hope, though logic quickly pushed that feeling aside. "What are we going to do?" Sarah finally broke the silence, her voice soft but edged with tension. Dr. Harper didn't respond immediately. Instead, she straightened, pulling off her stethoscope and letting it hang loosely around her neck. She glanced at the kitten's face, his sightless eyes half closed, as though he was already retreating from a world that had shown him nothing but cruelty. "We have to consider the quality of life," Dr. Harper said finally, her tone even, though the weight of the words was heavy. "He's blind. Severely underweight. The infection on his leg might spread if we don't treat it aggressively," and even then, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Sarah looked down at the clipboard in her hands, avoiding Dr. Harper's gaze. "But he's still fighting," she murmured, almost to herself. "He's still breathing." Dr. Harper sighed, turning her attention back to the kitten. She knew Sarah's heart was in the right place, but reality often demanded difficult choices. The clinic was small, with limited resources, and cases like this, cases where the odds of survival were slim, often ended in heartbreak. The kitten let out a faint, almost imperceptible mew, startling both women. It wasn't a cry of pain or fear, but something softer, almost resigned. Dr. Harper's chest tightened. She had been a vet long enough to recognize that sound. It was the sound of an animal on the brink of giving up. The silence in the room became almost suffocating. Even the steady hum of the clinic's ventilation system seemed muted, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The weight of the decision loomed heavy in the air, to intervene and risk prolonging suffering, or to end it now, sparing the kitten from further pain. Dr. Harper placed a gentle hand on the kitten's side, feeling the faint warmth of his body. She was about to speak when, out of nowhere, the muffled sound of claws on tile echoed from the hallway. It was faint at first, then grew louder, steady and purposeful. Both women turned toward the door as it creaked open. A small, muscular figure appeared in the doorway, his stocky frame silhouetted against the light from the hallway. It was Max, the clinic's unofficial mascot, a French bulldog with a personality as big as his heart. Max padded into the room, his snub nose twitching as he sniffed the air. His big, round eyes scanned the space before settling on the kitten. There was something in his gaze, an intensity that was almost human. Without hesitation, Max trotted over to the table, his claws clicking softly against the tile floor. Dr. Harper and Sarah exchanged puzzled glances, but neither spoke as Max placed his front paws on the edge of the table, hoisting himself up just enough to peer at the kitten. His ears perked, and he let out a soft huff, almost as if to say, "What's going on here?" For a moment, the despair in the room lifted, replaced by a strange sense of anticipation. The kitten, sensing Max's presence, stirred slightly, his tiny nose twitching as he caught the scent of the dog. Then, with a faint, almost imperceptible movement, the kitten turned his head toward Max, as though drawn to him by some invisible force. Dr. Harper blinked, surprised. She had never seen an animal respond to another so quickly, especially in such a fragile state. Max let out another soft huff, his eyes locked on the kitten, as if he understood something no one else could. And in that moment, the cold steel table didn't feel quite so cold anymore. The clinic door swung open with a gust of cold wind, rattling the bell overhead. Max, the French bulldog, trotted in with his usual swagger, his compact, muscular body moving with a confident rhythm. He was a familiar presence in the small veterinary practice, known not only for his charming personality but for his uncanny ability to sense when something, or someone, needed him. Trailing just behind him was his owner, Mrs. Bennet, a sprightly retiree with a warm smile and a penchant for spoiling her beloved companion. She was a regular at the clinic, often stopping by with Max for routine checkups or just to say hello. Today, however, her visit wasn't planned. "I'm so sorry to barge in like this, Dr. Harper," Mrs. Bennet called out as she stepped inside, brushing a strand of gray hair from her face. "Max practically dragged me here. I thought it might be the storm making him uneasy, but he's been acting so strange all morning." Max trotted ahead, his stubby tail wagging furiously as he made his way down the hallway. His ears twitched and his nose worked overtime, sniffing at the air as though following an invisible trail. His usual playful demeanor had been replaced by a sense of purpose, something Mrs. Bennet had rarely seen in him. Dr. Harper stepped out from the examination room just as Max reached the door. She raised an eyebrow at the sight of the determined dog. "Well, Max, what's all this about?" she asked with a hint of amusement. Max didn't pause to acknowledge her greeting. Instead, he pushed his nose against the door, letting out a low, insistent huff. Mrs. Bennet, slightly winded from trying to keep up with him, caught up and shrugged apologetically. "I don't know what's gotten into him. He's been restless all morning, and when I tried to turn back home, he refused to budge. It's like he knew we needed to come here." Dr. Harper's curiosity piqued, and she opened the door to the examination room. Max immediately slipped past her, his sharp eyes scanning the space until they landed on the tiny figure on the cold metal table. The sight of the kitten stopped Max in his tracks. For a moment, he stood completely still, his head tilted slightly as he studied the trembling little creature. Then, with a determined hop, he placed his front paws on the edge of the table, hoisting himself up just enough to get a closer look. Sarah, still holding the clipboard, let out a soft gasp. "What's he doing?" she whispered, her eyes darting between Max and the kitten. Mrs. Bennet stepped forward, her hand on Max's back as if to steady him. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice tinged with awe. "He's never acted like this before." Max leaned in closer, his snub nose gently brushing against the kitten's damp fur. The kitten stirred slightly, his tiny body shivering less as he responded to the unexpected warmth. Max let out a soft, almost imperceptible whine, as if trying to communicate something only he could understand. Dr. Harper watched in silence, her clinical detachment giving way to a mix of curiosity and wonder. She had known Max for years, treated him for everything from minor scrapes to routine vaccinations, but she had never seen him behave this way. It was as though he had taken on a role beyond that of a mere pet. He was a guardian, a protector. "He's always been special," Mrs. Bennet said quietly, almost as if reading Dr. Harper's thoughts. "Max has a way of sensing things, feelings, even. He knows when I'm upset before I even say a word. And now, it's like he knows this little one needs him." The kitten let out a faint mew, his tiny nose twitching as he caught Max's scent. Slowly, hesitantly, he turned his head toward the dog, his sightless eyes blinking as if trying to make sense of this new presence. Max responded by licking the kitten's head, a gentle, deliberate gesture that seemed to say, "You're not alone." The room, once heavy with despair, now felt lighter, as though the connection between the two animals had shifted something in the air. Sarah broke the silence, her voice trembling slightly. Maybe we shouldn't give up on him just yet." Dr. Harper nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on Max and the kitten. She had seen plenty of animals form bonds, but this was different. It wasn't just instinct or curiosity, it was something deeper, something that defied explanation. Max climbed down from the table, his work seemingly done for the moment, but he stayed close, sitting on the floor with his eyes fixed on the kitten. It was clear he wasn't going anywhere. "Well," Dr. Harper said finally, her voice steady but filled with newfound determination. "Let's see what we can do for him." Max wagged his tail as if in agreement, and for the first time that day, hope flickered in the hearts of everyone in the room. The air in the room felt different now. Where there had been an oppressive weight of inevitability, there was now a palpable sense of possibility, as if the simplest act could change everything. All eyes were on Max, the French bulldog, as he sat by the steel examination table, his ears perked and his large, expressive eyes fixed on the tiny, shivering kitten. Max wasn't a particularly tall dog, but his presence filled the room. His sturdy frame and determined demeanor gave him an aura of quiet confidence. He stood on his hind legs again, resting his front paws on the edge of the table, and leaned in closer. The kitten, still lying motionless, seemed to sense him. Though blind, the little creature's whiskers twitched faintly as Max's warm breath brushed against him. It was the first response the kitten had shown since being brought in, and the room collectively held its breath. Max let out a soft, rumbling noise, not quite a bark, but not a whine either. It was a sound of curiosity, of care, as if he was introducing himself in a language only animals could understand. Then, with deliberate gentleness, Max extended his nose toward the kitten, his snout brushing against the tiny body with the lightest of touches. The kitten flinched at first, his frail frame stiffening in response to the unexpected contact. But Max stayed still, his nose resting softly against the kitten's fur, unmoving except for the rhythmic rise and fall of his breath. The stillness lasted for a heartbeat, then another, until the kitten slowly relaxed, his body sinking back into the table. Sarah, standing by the door, placed a hand over her mouth, her eyes wide. "Did you see that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Dr. Harper nodded, though she didn't say a word. Her gaze was fixed on the scene before her, on the way Max's presence seemed to anchor the kitten, drawing him out of his fragile shell of fear and pain. And then it happened. The kitten moved. It wasn't much, just the tiniest lift of his head, a slight turn toward Max, but it was enough. His tiny nose twitched, seeking out the warmth and scent of the dog who had so suddenly and so completely filled the room with a quiet sense of security. Max responded by lowering his head slightly, giving the kitten space but keeping their connection intact. He let out another soft rumble, almost a hum, as though encouraging the kitten to keep going, to trust him. Dr. Harper finally spoke, her voice low but filled with wonder. "I've never seen anything like this," she said. "It's as if he knows exactly what to do." Mrs. Bennet, standing quietly in the corner, smiled softly. "That's Max for you. He's always had a way of making everyone feel safe, no matter who, or what, they are." The kitten let out a faint mew, the sound barely audible but carrying a note of something new, something that wasn't quite desperation or fear. It was tentative, almost questioning, as if he were trying to understand this strange, gentle presence that had come into his world. Max responded by licking the kitten's head with a single, deliberate swipe of his tongue. It was such a simple act, but it carried a weight that no one in the room could ignore. It wasn't just a gesture of care, it was a promise, unspoken but unmistakable. Sarah wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, sniffling quietly. "It's like, he's telling him it's going to be okay," she said, her voice breaking slightly. Dr. Harper nodded, her professional demeanor slipping as she allowed herself to smile. "Maybe it is," she said softly. The kitten, now fully leaning into Max's touch, seemed to grow calmer with every passing moment. His shallow breaths became steadier, his tiny body less rigid. It was as if Max's presence was rewiring something deep within him, replacing fear with something the kitten had never known before, comfort. For the first time since the kitten had been placed on the cold steel table, the room no longer felt lifeless. The connection between Max and the kitten seemed to radiate warmth, breaking through the sterile, clinical atmosphere and replacing it with something almost magical. Dr. Harper took a deep breath, her resolve strengthening. "We're going to try," she said firmly, turning to Sarah. "Let's clean up that wound and see what we can do about his nutrition. We'll fight for him." Max let out a soft bark, his stubby tail wagging furiously as if to show his agreement. He climbed down from the table but stayed close, his eyes never leaving the kitten. The kitten let out another faint mew, this one softer, more trusting. It was the first real sign of life, of hope, that anyone in the room had seen from him. And in that moment, as Max settled beside the table and the kitten leaned into the warmth of his newfound friend, it became clear to everyone in the room that this was no ordinary connection. This was the beginning of something extraordinary, a bond that would not only change the kitten's fate but touch the hearts of everyone lucky enough to witness it. Dr. Harper stood in the center of the examination room, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her face a mix of contemplation and caution. She was not someone who easily gave in to emotion. Her years as a veterinarian had taught her to balance her compassion with pragmatism. Yet, as she glanced between the tiny, blind kitten resting on the table and Max, the French Bulldog sitting protectively at its side, something inside her began to shift. The truth was that saving the kitten didn't seem practical. Blind from birth, severely underweight, and with an infected wound on his hind leg, the odds were heavily stacked against him. Even with the clinic's resources, the cost of treatment would be high, and the chance of success was slim. Sarah, standing by the cabinet and organizing supplies, finally broke the silence. "Dr. Harper," she said hesitantly, her voice softer than usual, "I know it doesn't make sense on paper, but, you saw how he responded to Max. Maybe there's more to him than we think." Dr. Harper sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's not just about the resources," she replied. "It's about his quality of life. Even if we manage to save him, what kind of life will he have? Blind animals struggle to find homes, especially ones with his level of trauma." Her words were logical, almost clinical, but they hung in the air like a shadow. Everyone in the room, even Mrs. Bennet, knew that the reality for animals like this kitten was harsh. Blind, injured, and abandoned, he was a creature the world had already written off. But Max, oblivious to their doubts, remained steadfast. He sat close to the table, his dark eyes watching the kitten with an intensity that was impossible to ignore. Every few moments, he would shift slightly, as if to reassure himself that the kitten was still there, still breathing. Mrs. Bennet, who had remained quiet for most of the exchange, finally spoke up. "You know," she began, her voice calm but firm, "when I found Max as a puppy, no one thought he'd amount to much, either." Dr. Harper turned to her, curious. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Bennet smiled softly, her hand resting on Max's back. "He was the runt of the litter. Weak, small, and not particularly healthy. The breeder told me he probably wouldn't make it past a few months. But I took one look at him and thought, he deserves a chance. And here he is now, healthier and happier than any of them predicted." Sarah glanced at Max, who wagged his tail at the sound of his name, and then at the kitten. "Maybe this little one just needs someone to believe in him," she said. Dr. Harper hesitated, her eyes returning to the kitten. He was so still, his tiny body barely moving except for the faint rise and fall of his chest. Yet, she couldn't forget how he had reacted to Max, the way he had turned his head toward the dog, the faint mew that seemed to carry a glimmer of trust. Still, doubt lingered in her mind. The kitten's blindness wasn't something that could be cured, and even if they managed to heal his physical wounds, his emotional scars might never fully heal. Adopting out a blind animal was notoriously difficult. Most potential owners wanted pets that were easy to care for, not ones that required special attention. As if sensing the weight of her thoughts, Max stood up and placed his front paws on the table again. He leaned in close to the kitten, letting out a soft, almost soothing noise that sounded like a cross between a grunt and a sigh. It wasn't loud or insistent, but it was enough to draw the kitten's attention. The kitten stirred slightly, his tiny nose twitching as he caught Max's scent. And then, with a strength no one expected, he let out a faint but clear mew. It was such a small sound, but it was filled with something undeniable, a will to survive. Dr. Harper blinked, her throat tightening. She glanced at Sarah, whose eyes were wide with hope, and then at Mrs. Bennet, who gave her a knowing nod. "I know it's a risk," Mrs. Bennet said gently, "but if Max sees something in this little one, maybe we should, too." Dr. Harper exhaled slowly, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. She wasn't one to take risks lightly, but something about this situation felt different. She couldn't shake the feeling that Max had brought the kitten here for a reason, that this unlikely bond between a dog and a blind kitten was more than just a coincidence. "All right," she said finally, her voice steady. "We'll do everything we can for him. But it's going to be a long road." Max let out a happy bark, his tail wagging furiously, as if he understood the decision and approved wholeheartedly. Sarah immediately moved to gather the supplies they would need: antibiotics for the kitten's wound, nutritional supplements, and a soft blanket to keep him warm. Dr. Harper gently lifted the kitten off the cold steel table, cradling him in her hands with a care that showed her own skepticism was starting to fade. As she wrapped him in the blanket, the kitten let out another soft mew, this one quieter but no less determined. Max sat nearby, his eyes never leaving the tiny bundle in Dr. Harper's hands, his posture radiating quiet confidence. In that moment, the doubts that had filled the room began to dissolve. The kitten's future was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: he wasn't alone anymore. He had Max, a dog who saw past his blindness and frailty to the spark of life that still burned within him. And he had a team of humans who, inspired by Max's unwavering faith, were willing to fight for him. Sometimes, it takes an unlikely hero to shatter prejudices and open the door to new possibilities. The first days after the decision to save the kitten were filled with uncertainty. Wrapped in a soft blanket and nestled in a small padded bed, the kitten was given everything he needed to survive: warmth, nourishment, and care. Yet, it was Max who proved to be the most crucial part of his recovery. Max seemed to instinctively understand the kitten's vulnerabilities. From the moment the tiny creature was brought home with Mrs. Bennet, Max took on a new role, not just as a protector, but as a guide, a friend, and a source of stability. It was as though he had appointed himself as the kitten's surrogate parent, a role he took with the utmost seriousness. The kitten, whom Mrs. Bennet decided to name Charlie, was still timid and fragile, but Max was endlessly patient. On their first night together, Mrs. Bennet set up a cozy corner in her living room for Charlie, complete with soft blankets and a small heating pad. Max, however, refused to leave the kitten's side. Instead of sleeping on his usual dog bed, he lay curled up just outside Charlie's little nest, his body forming a barrier between the kitten and the rest of the world. Charlie, though blind, seemed to sense Max's presence. He would let out faint, questioning mews in the dark, and Max would respond with soft grunts or a reassuring nudge of his nose. These simple interactions became the foundation of their bond, a silent language that only they seemed to understand. As the days turned into weeks, Charlie began to grow stronger. His fur, once patchy and dull, became soft and glossy, and the wound on his leg healed under Dr. Harper's watchful care. But what was most remarkable was how quickly he learned to navigate the world around him, thanks to Max. Max became Charlie's eyes. Whenever the kitten ventured out of his bed, Max was right there, walking alongside him, his stocky frame steady and unwavering. At first, Charlie was hesitant, his movements slow and cautious. He would paw tentatively at the floor, his head tilting as he tried to make sense of the sounds and scents around him. Max, as if understanding his hesitancy, would gently nudge him in the right direction or bark softly to guide him. One day, Mrs. Bennet watched in amazement as Charlie followed Max across the living room for the first time. The kitten's tiny paws patted along the carpet, his nose twitching as he followed Max's scent. Whenever he faltered or veered off course, Max would stop, turn back, and patiently wait for him to catch up. "Would you look at that?" Mrs. Bennet murmured to herself, a smile spreading across her face. "You'd think they've been doing this for years." As Charlie grew more confident, his playful side began to emerge. He would bat at Max's tail with his tiny paws or pounce clumsily toward the jingling sound of a toy bell. Max, ever the patient mentor, would indulge him, lying down and letting the kitten climb over him as if he were a living jungle gym. Despite his size and strength, Max was always careful, his movements slow and deliberate to ensure he didn't accidentally hurt his fragile companion. One afternoon, Mrs. Bennet found the two of them in the sunlit corner of the living room. Max was sprawled out on the floor, his eyes half closed in contentment, while Charlie lay nestled against his side, purring softly. The sight of them together was so peaceful, so natural, that it brought tears to her eyes. "They're a real pair, aren't they?" Sarah said a few days later when she came to visit and check on Charlie. She watched as Max gently nudged a piece of kibble toward Charlie, who sniffed it cautiously before taking a tentative bite. "They are," Mrs. Bennet replied with a smile. "Max has taken to him like he's his own pup. And Charlie, well, I don't think he'd have made it without Max." The most heartwarming part of their bond was how Max seemed to anticipate Charlie's needs. If Charlie got too close to the edge of the couch, Max would place a paw in front of him, creating a barrier. If the kitten mewed in distress, Max would rush to his side, offering a reassuring nuzzle or a warm lick. As the weeks went by, Charlie began to explore more confidently, always with Max by his side. They became inseparable, a team that defied expectations and challenged what anyone thought possible for a blind kitten. By the time Dr. Harper came for a follow-up visit, she was astonished at Charlie's progress. "He's thriving," she said, watching as the kitten playfully chased Max's tail. "I've never seen anything like it. Max really is his lifeline." Mrs. Bennet nodded, her eyes twinkling with pride. "They're more than just friends," she said. "They're family." It was true. Max and Charlie's bond had become something extraordinary, a partnership built on trust, patience, and unconditional love. In each other, they had found what they needed most. Max had discovered a purpose, and Charlie had found safety and a guide in a world he couldn't see. Their journey was far from over, but one thing was certain: together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead. Max had given Charlie a chance at life, and in return, Charlie had given Max something equally precious, a friend who trusted him completely. The story of Max and Charlie had become more than just a tale of survival. It was a testament to the power of compassion and the bonds that can form in the most unexpected of circumstances. As weeks turned into months, their connection deepened, and their lives intertwined in a way that inspired everyone who witnessed it. Charlie, the blind kitten who once lay trembling on a cold steel table, was now a confident, playful young cat. Though he couldn't see the world around him, he navigated it with ease, guided by the unwavering presence of Max. The dog, once a simple companion to Mrs. Bennet, had become a symbol of selfless love and resilience. In their small town, word of their bond spread. Neighbors stopped by to see the unlikely pair, and even Dr. Harper, who had initially doubted the kitten's chances, spoke of them often at the clinic. "They've changed the way I think," she admitted one day. "Charlie showed me that even the smallest, most vulnerable creatures can thrive when given a chance. And Max, he reminded me why I became a vet in the first place." But the impact of their story went beyond the clinic or Mrs. Bennet's living room. It challenged a deeper, ingrained prejudice, the idea that animals with disabilities or special needs were somehow less deserving of love. Charlie's blindness was no longer seen as a limitation, but as a unique part of who he was. Max's instinct to care for him, to guide him, wasn't born out of pity but out of an innate understanding that every life has value. Together, they taught everyone around them that what truly matters isn't perfection, but connection. Mrs. Bennet often reflected on what she had learned from the two of them. "Max didn't see Charlie as broken," she said one evening, stroking the kitten's soft fur as he purred in her lap. "He saw someone who needed him, and he didn't hesitate. If only people could be so pure in their love and acceptance." The story of Max and Charlie wasn't just about saving a life, it was about transforming perspectives. It made people question their own biases, their own quick judgments about what was possible for animals like Charlie. By the time spring arrived, Charlie had grown into a spirited, happy cat who trusted the world around him because of Max's steady guidance. They spent their days exploring the garden, with Max always keeping a watchful eye, and their evenings curled up together by the fireplace. One day, as Mrs. Bennet watched them from her chair, she smiled. "They're not just an inspiration for animals," she said softly. "They're a lesson for all of us." And that's exactly what Max and Charlie became, a story that stayed with everyone who heard it. A story that reminded people of the extraordinary things that can happen when we choose compassion over convenience, when we take the time to see potential where others see limitations. Their journey wasn't just about survival, it was about redefining what it means to thrive, to connect, and to love without conditions. How did you like the story of Max and Charlie? Share your thoughts about this unique bond in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more inspiring stories.